She hadn't laughed in 3 years. Not a chuckle, not even a hint of a smile. Psychiatrists called her an impenetrable vault, a case study in persistent traumatic mutism so severe that 12 specialists across Boston's most prestigious facilities had documented her condition in medical journals while failing to crack it. But that October afternoon, when the former Marine with oil-stained hands sat beside her on the cold concrete floor of a weathered garage in rural Pennsylvania and explained why a 1967 Mustang represented more than just American automotive history, something shifted behind those dark, vacant eyes. The shift was microscopic, invisible to anyone not watching closely. But it was there. 72 hours earlier, Sophia Clark would speak her first words since the night her mother died. And those words would be a refusal so absolute, it would fracture the carefully constructed world her father had built around her silence. The machinery of that fracture was already in motion, gears turning in the rain-soaked darkness of an October evening, when a fuel relay failed on Route 22 outside Oak Ridge and forced a convoy of wealth into the orbit of a man who understood trauma in ways no amount of money could purchase. The rain hammered Davis Auto's corrugated metal roof like 1,000 impatient fingers, each drop adding to the symphony that Marcus Davis had grown accustomed to over 27 years of ownership. Outside, the Pennsylvania countryside vanished behind sheets of water, turning the afternoon dark as dusk. Inside, the garage carried the smell of motor oil, coffee that had sat too long on the burner, and the comforting scent of old leather from the tattered workshop manual Mark had inherited from his father. The manual sat open on the workbench, its pages yellowed and grease-stained, a roadmap to an era when cars were simpler and men fixed what broke with their own hands. Mark tightened the last bolt on a 1978 Chevy pickup's carburetor, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision despite the arthritis that had begun settling into his knuckles. 58 years had etched themselves into his face like topography, creases around eyes that had squinted into desert suns in Kuwait and Iraq, lines carved by worry during firefights, a permanently furrowed brow from concentrating on engines for nearly 3 decades. His salt and pepper hair stayed cropped military short, a habit he'd never abandoned after leaving the Marines. Some patterns ran too deep to break, even when the uniform came off for good. "Tommy, hand me that timing light." His voice carried the slight rasp of a man who'd breathed in too much dust during sandstorms half a world away, particles that had settled in his lungs and never quite left. From the corner of the garage, 8-year-old Tommy Davis looked up from his arrangement of die-cast model cars, a collection that had grown from a handful of Hot Wheels into a carefully curated timeline of American automotive history. The boy's eyes lit up at being included in his father's work, eager in that way children are when they sense they're being taught something important, something that connects them to the world of adults and competence. Tommy set down a miniature 1957 Thunderbird with reverence and scampered across the concrete floor, his sneakers leaving small wet prints from where he'd been standing near the partially open side door, watching the downpour with the fascination kids reserve for storms. He held up the timing light with both hands, treating the tool like something precious. "This one, Dad?" "That's it, buddy. Good man." Mark ruffled his son's hair and felt the familiar pang, the one that never quite dulled no matter how much time passed. Sarah should be here for this moment. She would have loved seeing Tommy's face light up at learning something new, the way her own face used to brighten at the smallest discoveries, finding joy in things other people overlooked. 5 years had passed since breast cancer had ended her battle, leaving Mark to raise their son alone, in a world that suddenly felt too big and too empty. She'd been a military nurse, tough as nails and twice as sharp, the kind of woman who could reset a dislocated shoulder with clinical efficiency and then slip you an extra pudding cup during evening rounds, because she understood that small kindnesses mattered most when everything hurt. They'd met during his second deployment to the Gulf, when a training accident had landed him in the medical unit with his shoulder wrenched so badly he'd thought his arm might never work right again. Sarah had proven him wrong about that, and about a dozen other things he'd believed about himself. Their love had been forged in the crucible of military service, tempered by multiple deployments, tested by the hard transition to civilian life, where the rules were different and the dangers harder to identify. When they'd both finally hung up their uniforms, The garage had been Sarah's idea. "Your father's place is just sitting there, Mark, and you're good with your hands. Build something." So he had. 27 years of building, fixing, maintaining, keeping things running when they wanted to quit, coaxing life out of metal and wire and fuel. The radio in the corner crackled through "Tuesday's Gone" by Lynyrd Skynyrd, the sound occasionally distorted by the storm's interference with the ancient antenna Mark kept meaning to replace, but never did. Music had been Sarah's domain. She'd known all the lyrics to every song on the classic rock stations, sang along while reorganizing his tool chest because she couldn't stand seeing things out of order. After she'd gone, Mark made sure to keep the radio playing. It was one of the many ways he kept her memory alive in the garage she'd helped him purchase with their combined discharge pay and a loan from his father that had taken 15 years to repay. "Dad, can we work on the Mustang after you finish Mrs. Peterson's truck?" The hope in Tommy's voice was impossible to deny, though Mark checked his watch out of habit. An hour until closing, maybe less, given the weather. Nobody was driving in this mess unless they had to. "I think we can squeeze in some time." In the far corner of the garage, partially hidden under a custom car cover Mark had sewn himself from canvas tarp, sat his pride and cautious joy. A 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback, Highland Green, the exact shade from the bullet film. Mark had purchased the rusted shell 3 years ago, shortly after Sarah's passing, when he'd needed something to occupy his hands and mind during the long, empty evenings when Tommy slept and the house felt like a museum of everything he'd lost. The restoration project had become a bridge between father and son, a way to connect when words failed them both, which happened more often than Mark liked to admit. Tommy had gone silent for a full month after the funeral, not speaking a single word, no matter how gently Mark prodded or how many child psychologists offered their careful questions and compassionate, but ultimately useless advice. What had finally broken through wasn't therapy or medication or any of the recommended interventions. It was the day Mark brought home the Mustang's rusted shell on a flatbed trailer and asked Tommy if he wanted to help make it beautiful again. The boy had stared at the car for a long moment, then looked up at his father with those eyes that were so much like Sarah's, it hurt. Mom would have loved this car. 4 words that opened the floodgates, and Mark had never been more grateful for a pile of rust and seized bolts in his life. Now the Mustang was nearly complete, engine rebuilt and purring like a satisfied cat. Bodywork finished and painted that perfect shade of green, chrome gleaming. Only the interior remained. Seats that needed recovering and a dashboard that required careful restoration to maintain the car's authenticity. Mark had already ordered the correct shade of upholstery, saved for months to afford the factory-spec materials, because if you were going to do something, you did it right. "I was thinking we could start on the interior today, make some progress before dinner." Tommy's grin could have powered the garage's lights without electricity. The Mustang was more than just a car to Mark. It was a legacy he was rebuilding for his son, a tangible piece of American history they could share, something Tommy could point to years from now and say, "My dad and I built that together when I was 8 and learning what it meant to fix broken things." The sudden flash of headlights through the rain-streaked windows interrupted Mark's planning. A vehicle had pulled into the gravel lot outside, its high beams cutting through the downpour like searchlights. Not one of the locals. Mark knew every truck and sedan in Oak Ridge by sight, could identify most by sound alone, the particular rattle of Mrs. Peterson's exhaust or the whistle in old Jim's wheel bearings that he refused to get fixed because he'd grown fond of it. This was something else entirely, something that didn't belong on these roads. "Looks like we've got a customer, but go ahead and start organizing those interior swatches for the Mustang. I'll be with you as soon as I can." Tommy nodded and headed back to his corner while Mark wiped his hands on a shop rag and moved toward the large bay door. Through the glass panels, he could make out the sleek silhouette of a Cadillac Escalade, midnight black and gleaming despite the rain, the kind of vehicle that usually bypassed Oak Ridge entirely, sticking to the interstate on its way to somewhere more significant. Mark pressed the button to raise the garage door, the mechanical groan joining the cacophony of the storm. The Escalade eased forward, water cascading off its polished hood as it entered the shelter. Mark noticed the Massachusetts plates first, then the discreet logo on the driver's door. Clark Technologies. The name triggered a distant memory, something he'd read in a business magazine in the dentist's waiting room. Software empire, cybersecurity, billions with a capital B. The kind of money that existed in a different universe from the one where Mark paid bills and worried about Tommy's college fund. The driver's door opened, and a man emerged who looked like he'd been assembled from a police procedural's casting call for private security. Broad shoulders filled a tailored black suit, eyes alert and scanning the garage with professional thoroughness, an earpiece partially hidden by close-cropped hair, the slight bulge under his left arm where a shoulder holster would sit. Everything about him screamed protection detail, the kind of training that didn't come from watching YouTube videos. Mark recognized the bearing, the controlled movement, the way the man's weight stayed balanced and ready. Military, probably Marines given the haircut and posture. Recent enough that the habits hadn't faded. "Are you the mechanic?" The man's tone was professional but clipped, someone used to asking questions and getting quick answers. Mark straightened unconsciously, falling into a stance he'd used when addressing superior officers, spine aligned and shoulders back. "Marcus Davis, this is my shop." "Vincent Porter, we've got a fuel relay issue." Car started making strange noises about 10 miles back. Then the check engine light came on. Vincent glanced back at the Escalade, and Mark caught something in his expression, a flicker of concern that went beyond normal vehicle trouble. "Can you take a look? We're on a tight schedule." "I can look, but parts for these newer models can take a day or two to arrive if needed." Mark was already moving toward the vehicle, reaching for his diagnostic scanner from the workbench. Vincent's jaw tightened in a way that suggested tight schedules and delays didn't mix well in his world. "We need to be in Pittsburgh by tomorrow morning." "I'll do what I can. You folks can wait in the office. There's coffee. Might be a bit strong by now." Vincent didn't move toward the office. Instead, he opened the rear passenger door of the Escalade, and Mark caught his first glimpse of the girl. She couldn't have been more than 17. With long, dark hair that fell in carefully maintained waves over the shoulders of what Mark recognized as an expensive coat, the kind with a designer label he'd never heard of, but knew cost more than his monthly mortgage. Her face was striking, not conventionally pretty in the magazine way, but compelling, with high cheekbones and a delicate jawline that hinted at generations of good breeding and better nutrition. But it was her eyes that made Mark pause mid-step. Diagnostic scanner forgotten in his hand. They were dark, almost black in the garage's fluorescent lighting, and utterly vacant. Not sad, not angry, not afraid. Empty, like windows into an abandoned house where furniture had been removed and dust gathered in corners nobody visited anymore. Mark had seen that look before, on the faces of young Marines after their first firefight, after they'd watched friends die and realized the world was a more terrible place than they'd been prepared to accept. The 1,000-yard stare, older soldiers called it, when someone looked through you instead of at you, because looking at anything real hurt too much. "Miss Clark will be delayed briefly. The mechanic needs to examine the vehicle." Vincent's tone had softened slightly when addressing the girl, a gentleness that contradicted his tactical bearing. The girl stepped out of the car with mechanical precision, someone going through motions they'd rehearsed but found no joy in. Mark noticed her hands, long, slender fingers that looked like they should be playing piano or violin, not clutching the small leather-bound notebook she held like a shield against her chest. It took Mark a moment to make the connection, pieces clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. Clark Technologies, Massachusetts plates, private security. This had to be Sophia Clark, daughter of Harrison Clark, the tech mogul whose face graced business magazine covers and whose company's software protected everything from Pentagon databases to nuclear power plants. Mark had read about the family years ago, some tragedy involving the mother, though the details escaped him now. He made a mental note to Google it later, when curiosity overcame the voice in his head that said other people's pain was none of his business. "The office is just through that door. It's not much, but it's warm." Mark pointed to the small room separated from the main garage by a glass partition, visible but private enough for comfort. Sophia didn't acknowledge him, didn't seem to hear or register his words at all. Instead, her gaze drifted across the garage until it landed on Tommy, still arranging his model cars in the corner, with the focused concentration children bring to tasks adults dismiss as play. Without a word to either man, without even a glance in Mark's direction, Sophia walked directly toward the boy. Her expensive boots made soft tapping sounds on the concrete floor, each step deliberate and measured. Vincent made a move to follow, protective instinct kicking in, but Mark caught his eye and gave a slight shake of his head. Something told him to let this play out, to see where this strange moment led. Vincent hesitated, professional training warring with whatever orders he'd been given about keeping Sophia safe. But finally he stayed back, watching with the intensity of someone prepared to intervene at the first sign of trouble. Sophia stopped a few feet from Tommy's corner and simply stood there, observing. After a long moment, she lowered herself to the floor with that same mechanical precision, carefully arranging her expensive coat beneath her, and sat cross-legged on the concrete. She didn't speak, didn't smile, just sat and watched Tommy's meticulous arrangement of miniature vehicles with an attention that seemed almost clinical, like she was studying a specimen under glass. Tommy, who normally shied away from strangers with the wariness of a child who'd learned early that the world could take away people you loved, looked up at her with curious eyes unclouded by adult assumptions about personal space or appropriate behavior. "Do you like cars?" His voice was small but clear, a question offered without expectation of answer. Sophia didn't respond, but her gaze fixed on the 1957 Thunderbird model in Tommy's hand, the one he'd been holding when Vincent arrived. Tommy seemed unfazed by her silence, continuing as though she'd answered in the affirmative. "This one's a T-Bird. Dad says these had the first backup lights as standard equipment, which was really advanced for 1957 because most cars didn't have anything to help you see when you were going backward, and that's why lots of people hit things in parking lots." He held the model up for her inspection, and Mark watched from across the garage as Sophia hesitated. It was the first real reaction he'd seen from her, a crack in the mechanical facade. Slowly, like someone testing water temperature before committing to a swim, she extended her hand. Tommy placed the die-cast car in her palm with the solemnity of someone transferring something sacred, and Sophia brought it closer to her face, examining it with an intensity that seemed at odds with her previously vacant expression. "I've got more. Want to see? I'm making a timeline of American automotive history. Dad helps me learn about each one so I know what made them special and why people remember them even though they're old now." Vincent cleared his throat, breaking whatever spell had settled over the corner. "Mr. Davis, the vehicle?" Mark nodded, tearing his eyes away from the strange tableau of the billionaire's daughter sitting on his dirty garage floor with his son. "Right. Let me take a look." As Mark connected his diagnostic scanner to the Escalade's computer system, he kept one eye on the corner. Tommy had resumed his narration, explaining each model in his collection to Sophia with the enthusiasm of a natural teacher, someone who'd found joy in sharing knowledge and assumed everyone else would find it just as fascinating. Sophia remained silent but appeared to be listening, her focus shifting between Tommy's face and the models he displayed with a deliberateness that suggested she was actually processing his words rather than just enduring them. The scanner beeped, confirming Vincent's assessment. Fuel relay, likely triggered by the heavy rain and electrical interference common in vehicles with aftermarket security modifications. It was a relatively simple fix, but Mark would need to order the part from his supplier in Bedford. The scanner also revealed something else: military-grade encryption on the vehicle's computer system, sophisticated enough that Mark's diagnostic tool was having trouble reading some of the data. Clark Technologies had clearly modified this vehicle beyond standard security features, which made sense given who rode in it, but complicated the repair. Good news and bad news. Mark straightened, wiping his hands, though they weren't dirty yet. Vincent had positioned himself where he could keep Sophia in his sightline while maintaining visual contact with Mark, a practiced arrangement that spoke of years doing this specific job. "I can fix it, but I'll need to get the part from my supplier in Bedford. Won't arrive until tomorrow morning." Vincent's expression darkened like storm clouds rolling in. That's not acceptable. Surely there's somewhere closer. Mark shook his head, keeping his tone neutral and professional, even though he could feel the first stirrings of irritation at being told his assessment wasn't acceptable. Not for this model. Not with the aftermarket security system you've got installed. I'm assuming Clark Technologies has some custom modifications to this vehicle. A flicker of surprise crossed Vincent's face, quickly controlled, but not quickly enough. How did you know that? Mark tapped the scanner's display screen. Readings are different from standard. Military-grade encryption on the computer system. I've seen similar setups on convoy vehicles back when I was keeping Humvees running in Kuwait and Iraq. Makes sense given who you work for. Vincent studied Mark with newfound interest, reassessing, seeing him as something more than just another small-town mechanic. You know your stuff. 27 years fixing cars, plus some time in the sandbox making sure our rides didn't quit in the middle of firefights. I've seen a few things. While they spoke, Mark noticed Sophia had opened her notebook and appeared to be sketching something, her hand moving across the page with quick, confident strokes. Tommy watched, his model cars temporarily forgotten, mesmerized by whatever she was creating. Mark took a step closer, careful not to intrude, but curious despite himself. Look, I can call ahead to Pittsburgh, have another car waiting. We'll leave this one here and return for it later in the week. Vincent was already reaching for his phone, making executive decisions with the ease of someone accustomed to solving problems with logistics and money. Mark nodded his agreement. Your call. I can start the diagnostic work today, order the part, and have you back on the road by noon tomorrow if you want to circle back. Vincent stepped away to make his call, and Mark took the opportunity to approach Tommy and Sophia. As he drew closer, he could see what she was drawing. A remarkably detailed sketch of Tommy's 1957 Thunderbird, rendered with precise, confident strokes that spoke of formal training and natural talent. She'd captured not just the car's physical details, but something essential about its character, giving the small toy a dignity and presence it hadn't possessed before. That's really good. Mark crouched down to their level, making himself less imposing. Sophia didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his presence at all, just continued drawing with focused intensity. She was adding minute details to the Thunderbird's chrome trim now, tiny flourishes that most people wouldn't notice, but that made the difference between a drawing and art. She's making my T-Bird fancy, Dad. Look, she got all the little parts right, even the ones I didn't know were there until she drew them. Tommy's grin was infectious, the kind of pure joy that made Mark's chest tight with love and gratitude that this kid had somehow survived losing his mother without losing his capacity for wonder. Mark studied the drawing more carefully, noting the way Sophia had captured light reflecting off chrome, the suggestion of speed in still lines, the weight and solidity of metal rendered in pencil strokes. You've got a good eye. Johnny's been collecting these since he was 4, started with Hot Wheels, and now he's graduated to the detailed historical models. He knows more about automotive design evolution than most adults. Tommy beamed at the praise, and Mark caught the faintest flicker of something in Sophia's eyes. Not quite interest, but perhaps the absence of emptiness. A momentary engagement with the world outside her head. Then Vincent returned, phone in hand, and whatever Mark had glimpsed vanished like morning fog under sunlight. We've got a car meeting us in Bedford, 40 minutes from here. Miss Clark, we need to go. Sophia didn't move immediately. She finished the line she was drawing, careful and deliberate, then tore the page from her notebook with a clean, precise motion. She placed it beside Tommy's collection, a gift given without ceremony or expectation of thanks. Only then did she rise, brushing imaginary dust from her coat with practiced movements that suggested this was ritual rather than necessity. Thank you for letting us use your garage, Mr. Davis. Send the bill to this address. Vincent handed Mark a business card with the Clark Technologies logo embossed in silver, the kind of card that probably cost more to print than Mark's entire stack of generic business cards from the office supply store. Mark pocketed it with a nod. I'll call when the car is ready. Shouldn't take more than a day once the part arrives. As Vincent ushered Sophia toward the door, where a town car was now waiting despite the continued downpour, Mark noticed she glanced back once at Tommy's corner. Her expression hadn't changed, that careful neutrality still firmly in place. but something about the set of her shoulders seemed different. Less rigid, perhaps. Or maybe Mark was seeing what he wanted to see, reading hope into a moment that didn't contain any. After they'd gone, after the town car's taillights had disappeared into the rain-soaked darkness, Mark walked over to Tommy, who was carefully examining the drawings Sophia had left behind. The boy held it with the reverence usually reserved for treasured possessions, birthday presents, or the model cars he loved most. "She didn't say anything, Dad. Not one word. But she drew this." Tommy held up the sketch, and Mark took the paper, studying those precise lines and detailed shading. In the corner, in an elegant script that spoke of years of private education and careful instruction, was a small signature. S.C. Sophia Clark. Mark murmured the name, feeling pieces click into place as memory surfaced. 3 years ago, there had been a news story, brief but tragic, about the wife of tech billionaire Harrison Clark being killed in a car accident. The daughter had been in the car but survived physically unharmed. Mark recalled Sarah commenting on the tragedy while folding laundry, her nurse's instinct for recognizing hidden wounds making her wonder aloud what would become of the poor girl who'd survived when her mother hadn't. Now Mark knew. Sophia Clark had survived, at least in the technical sense. Her body had walked away from the wreckage, but something in her had gone silent, had shut down so completely that 3 years later she still didn't speak, still moved through the world like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. "Can we keep it, Dad?" Tommy was already clearing a space on the corkboard where he displayed his favorite car facts and pictures from automotive magazines, making room for Sophia's drawing like it deserved a place of honor. Mark nodded, handing the drawing back. "Sure, buddy. It's a gift, and gifts are meant to be kept and appreciated. Now, how about we close up early and work on that Mustang? I think we've had enough excitement for one day." As Tommy pinned the drawing carefully to the board, making sure all 4 corners were secure, Mark couldn't shake the image of Sophia's empty eyes. He'd seen that look before, on the faces of young Marines after their first firefight, after they'd watched friends bleed out in desert sand, and realized the training hadn't prepared them for the reality of watching someone die. The 1,000-yard stare, they called it. But those Marines had eventually found their way back with time and the right kind of support, with brothers who understood and didn't demand more than they could give. Mark wondered if Sophia Clark had anyone giving her that kind of time and space, or if she was surrounded by people who kept trying to fix her silence instead of sitting with it, accepting it, letting it be what it needed to be until she was ready to break it herself. Probably the latter, given her father's resources and the human tendency to throw solutions at problems instead of patience. The next morning broke clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out overnight and left behind puddles that reflected the crisp blue October sky like scattered mirrors. Mark arrived at the garage earlier than usual, eager to get the diagnostic work completed on the Clark vehicle before his regular customers began arriving with their more modest problems and smaller budgets. Tommy was spending the day with Mrs. Murphy, the neighbor who watched him when school was out, a retired teacher who treated Tommy like the grandchild she'd never had, and didn't charge Mark nearly what her time was worth. Mark had just finished brewing the first pot of coffee when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Expecting his parts delivery, he was surprised to see a rideshare car pull up beside the garage. Even more surprising was the passenger who emerged. Sophia Clark, alone this time, with no sign of Vincent or any other security personnel. She wore simpler clothes today, dark jeans and a gray cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Mark's entire wardrobe, but looked understated enough to pass for normal. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried the same leather notebook from yesterday, along with a cardboard tray holding 2 coffee cups from an artisanal cafe in Bedford, 30 minutes away. Mark wiped his hands on a shop rag and opened the side door, keeping his voice casual, as though Billionaire's daughters showed up at his garage every day without warning or escort. "Good morning." Sophia didn't respond verbally, but she held out the coffee tray, offering one of the cups to Mark, with a directness that bypassed social niceties and went straight to practical transaction. He accepted it with a nod of thanks, noticing the neat handwriting on the cup. Black, no sugar, for the mechanic. Someone had been paying attention yesterday, observing and remembering details. "Thank you. This is good coffee, much better than what I brew here." And it was. Rich and smooth in a way that made Mark's bargain brand grounds taste like dishwater by comparison. Sophia nodded slightly, the first acknowledgement she'd given that she even heard him, and glanced around the garage with those dark eyes that seemed to search for something specific. "Tommy's not here today. He's with the neighbor when there's no school. Teacher in service day. One of those professional development things they do periodically." A flicker of disappointment crossed Sophia's face, so brief Mark almost missed it, gone faster than morning frost under sunlight. Then she walked over to Tommy's corner where his models remained arranged in their careful timeline, stood looking at them for a long moment that stretched into two, then turned her gaze to the corkboard where her drawing was now prominently displayed among Tommy's favorite automotive facts and magazine clippings. Mark sipped his coffee, watching her and learning something his military training had taught him long ago. Sometimes the best thing to say was nothing at all. Silence could be a gift, a space where pressure released and people found their own way without being directed or managed or fixed. After a full minute, Sophia settled onto the floor in the same spot she'd occupied yesterday, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and began to sketch with that same focused intensity. Mark took this as his cue to return to work. He pulled the Escalade into the center bay and began the process of accessing the fuel relay, the familiar routine of mechanical work allowing his mind to wander while his hands stayed busy. He wondered what Harrison Clark would think if he could see his daughter now, sitting cross-legged on the dirty floor of a rural Pennsylvania garage, silently drawing in a notebook while a middle-aged mechanic fixed the family's disabled vehicle. The incongruity of it struck Mark like a wrong note in familiar music. Sophia in her expensive clothes and careful grooming, sitting in a space designed for grease and hard work and calloused hands. For nearly an hour, the garage existed in comfortable silence, broken only by the classic rock station playing softly and the occasional sound of Mark's tools against metal. Sophia remained absorbed in her drawing, her pencil moving with quiet confidence across the page. Mark had progressed to removing the faulty relay when she finally stood and walked over to the workbench nearest his bay, not approaching him directly, but getting close enough that he could see her without turning. Without speaking, she set her notebook down where he could see it, opened to reveal what she'd been working on. On the page was a detailed sketch of his garage, not just the physical space, but the feeling of it, the way morning light filtered through the high windows and painted everything gold. The organized chaos of his tool wall, where every wrench and socket had its place. The dignified presence of the half-restored Mustang under its canvas cover. She captured the garage as Mark himself saw it. Not just a building, but a sanctuary. A place where broken things came to be made whole again. "You've got a real talent for this. You see things other people miss, details they walk past without noticing." Sophia didn't respond, but she remained standing beside him, her eyes on the sketch with something that might have been pride or might have been simple acknowledgement of work done well. Mark gestured toward the covered Mustang with a socket wrench still in his hand. "I was working on the interior of that Mustang with Tommy yesterday. It's a '67 fastback, Highland green, like the one Steve McQueen drove in Bullet. Been restoring it for about 3 years now. Engine's done, bodywork's finished. Just need to complete the interior and detail work. Make it perfect." He wasn't sure why he was telling her this, except that something about her silence invited confidences rather than demanding them, creating a space where words could come when they were ready, instead of being extracted like confessions. It reminded him of the way his unit's chaplain used to sit quietly beside troubled Marines, not pushing or prodding, just being present and available until they were ready to talk about whatever was eating them from the inside out. "My wife Sarah and I always wanted a classic Mustang. Never had the time or money when she was alive, always something more important that needed attention or funding. After she passed, it seemed like a good project to keep my hands busy and teach Tommy about cars, about how things get built and maintained, and sometimes rebuilt completely when they fall apart." Sophia moved closer as Mark worked, watching his hands manipulate tools with the same intense focus she'd given Tommy's models the day before. Mark continued his explanation, detailing the process of replacing the relay as though she were an apprentice learning the trade, someone who needed to understand not just what he was doing, but why each step mattered. She didn't ask questions, couldn't ask questions, but her attention never wavered, tracking each movement like she was committing the process to memory. When the garage phone rang, Mark excused himself to answer it, wiping his hands on a rag already dark with old grease. His part supplier was calling to say the delivery would be delayed until afternoon due to inventory issues at the warehouse. Mark thanked him and hung up, turning back to Sophia with an apologetic shrug that felt inadequate. Looks like we'll be waiting a bit longer for that part. Could be a few hours. You're welcome to stay, but it might be boring just watching me putter around. I can call you a rideshare if you'd prefer to come back later. Sophia shook her head, another small but definite response, and returned to Tommy's corner. She settled back onto the floor with her notebook, flipping to a fresh page. Mark continued working on preliminary stages of the repair, then moved to Mrs. Peterson's truck, which needed an oil change before pickup at noon. The morning progressed in that same strange but not uncomfortable silence, broken only by the radio playing softly and the occasional clang of tools against metal, sounds that had become so familiar Mark barely registered them anymore. Around 11 o'clock, the side door burst open, and Tommy rushed in, his face flushed with excitement and residual cold from outside. "Dad, Mrs. Murphy had to go to the dentist for an emergency, so she dropped me off early. Her tooth was really hurting, and she said she couldn't wait anymore, and I told her it was okay because I like being here anyway." He stopped short when he spotted Sophia, his eyes widening with recognition and something that looked like genuine delight. "You came back! I didn't think I'd see you again because Dad said sometimes people have complicated lives and can't always do what they want, even when they want to do it." Sophia looked up from her notebook, and Mark saw something remarkable happen. The corners of her mouth twitched slightly upward, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one he'd seen on her face since she'd arrived. Tommy approached her without hesitation, without the awkwardness that sometimes accompanied his interactions with adults who weren't Mark or Mrs. Murphy, dropping his backpack by the door with a thud that spoke of textbooks and forgotten homework. "I brought my new model today. It's a 1963 Corvette Stingray, the split-window one. Want to see?" Without waiting for a response that wouldn't come anyway, Tommy pulled a small box from his jacket pocket and sat down beside Sophia, carefully opening the package to reveal a die-cast model of the iconic sports car. Sophia set aside her notebook and focused on the tiny vehicle as Tommy began explaining its historical significance with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found his favorite subject and an audience willing to listen. This was the first year they called it Stingray, and it had this really cool split rear window that they only made for 1 year because people complained they couldn't see out the back when they were driving. Dad says sometimes the things that make something special are the things that don't always make practical sense. Like how the best designs aren't always the most convenient, but they're beautiful. And that's worth something too. Mark smiled at his son's perfect recall, remembering that conversation from a car show last summer when they'd spent an afternoon looking at vintage Corvettes and discussing what made certain design choices legendary, even when they were impractical. As he watched Tommy and Sophia, Mark was struck by how naturally his son had adapted to her silence, not seeming to mind or even particularly notice that she never responded verbally. Tommy simply continued his enthusiastic monologue about the Corvette's features, occasionally pausing as though giving her time to absorb the information, treating her silence as thoughtful listening rather than absence. "I'm going to add it to the timeline right here, between the 62 and the 64, because historically, this was when American sports cars really started to compete with the European ones." David says before this, people thought you had to buy a Ferrari or a Jaguar if you wanted a real sports car. But then Chevrolet showed them wrong. Sophia nodded, that same small but meaningful response Mark had seen before. Then, to his genuine astonishment, she reached for her notebook, wrote something on a blank page with quick, decisive strokes, and turned it so Tommy could read. The boy's face lit up like someone had plugged him into a power source. "Dad!" She wants to know if she can help organize the timeline. She thinks maybe we should group them by type, too, not just year. Like muscle cars together and sports cars together and trucks in their own section. Mark set down his wrench and walked over, curious about what had prompted this first real interaction beyond passive observation. Sophia's elegant handwriting posed the question clearly. May I help arrange them chronologically and by category? It would create a more comprehensive display.
Of course you can help. Tommy's been wanting to create a proper display for months, but we haven't had time to figure out the best system. There's some balsa wood on the shelf over there we've been meaning to use for platforms, and I've got wood glue in the supply cabinet if you need it. For the next hour, as Mark continued working on Mrs. Peterson's truck and fielding phone calls from customers, Tommy and Sophia collaborated on a tiered display for his model car collection. Tommy chattered continuously, explaining each vehicle's significance with the kind of detail that would bore most adults, but seemed to engage Sophia completely. She arranged the models with precise attention to historical accuracy and visual balance, occasionally writing notes in her notebook to show Tommy, suggestions about placement or grouping that he responded to with enthusiastic agreement, or friendly debate about specific car facts that Mark could hear from across the garage. It was the most animated Mark had seen his son in months. Tommy had struggled to connect with children his own age since Sarah's death, finding more comfort in the company of adults who shared his interests in cars and history and the concrete facts that made the world feel orderly and understandable. Watching him with Sophia, Mark realized his son had found a kindred spirit, albeit an unlikely one, someone who communicated differently but understood the importance of getting details right, of treating small things with the respect they deserved. When the parts delivery finally arrived at 1 o'clock, Mark almost regretted it. He installed the new fuel relay efficiently, tested the Escalade systems with his scanner, confirmed everything read normal, and then closed the hood with a metallic thunk that seemed too final. As he wiped his hands clean, he glanced over at the corner where Tommy was showing Sophia how to use a small hand drill to create mounting holes in the display board they were constructing. Both of them bent over the work with matching concentration. Vehicle's ready. Good as new. Should get you wherever you need to go without any more trouble. Sophia looked up, and for the first time Mark saw clear disappointment on her face, unmistakable and unguarded. She set down the drill carefully with the precision of someone who'd been taught to treat tools with respect, and reached for her phone. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, typing something Mark couldn't see. She showed him the display, a rideshare app indicating a car was already en route, arriving in 7 minutes. I see you've got it covered. The bill for the repair will go to the address on the card your driver gave me yesterday. Should be straightforward, just parts and labor, nothing complicated. Sophia nodded, then returned to Tommy to help him secure the last of the models to their new display. Mark watched them work, struck by the transformation in Sophia's demeanor since yesterday. She still hadn't spoken aloud, probably wouldn't speak today, or tomorrow, or the day after that. But her body language had shifted from that rigid, mechanical precision to something more fluid and present. The vacancy in her eyes had been replaced by focus and purpose as she helped Tommy complete his project, like she'd found something worth paying attention to in a world that had stopped making sense 3 years ago. When the rideshare car pulled up outside, Sophia carefully packed her notebook and pencils into a small backpack Mark hadn't noticed before, probably because he'd been focused on her face and hands rather than her accessories. She stood, brushing dust from her jeans with automatic movements, and looked at the completed car display with what might have been satisfaction, though her expression remained mostly neutral. Will you come back tomorrow? We could start on the information cards for each car, write down all the important facts so people understand why they're special. Tommy's voice carried hope mixed with expectation. The assumption that of course she'd return, because why wouldn't she when they had such a good project going? Sophia hesitated, then reached for her notebook one last time. She wrote something, tore out the page with that same clean, precise motion, and handed it to Tommy before walking to the door. She paused there, looking back at the garage as though committing it to memory, cataloging details she might need later. Mark watched her slip outside to the waiting car, disappearing into a world of money and resources and problems he couldn't begin to understand. Tommy stared at the note in his hand, a grin spreading across his face like sunrise. David, she's coming back tomorrow, and she says my car knowledge is impressive and precise, which I think means she thinks I'm smart about cars. Can we have her help with the information cards?
She writes really pretty, and I bet it would look professional. Looks like you've made a friend, buddy. A very unusual friend, but sometimes the best friendships are the ones that surprise you.
That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed, still talking about what they'd work on with Sophia tomorrow, Mark sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, something he rarely did since computers felt like Sarah's territory, and touching them without her felt like trespassing. But her mother, renowned concert pianist Victoria Hart Clark, had died 3 years ago in a car accident on the evening of Sophia's 14th birthday. They had been returning from a performance at the New England Conservatory, where Sophia, a musical prodigy like her mother, had played violin in a student showcase. According to the articles, meticulously researched pieces that balanced tragedy with respectful distance, Sophia had been in the car but escaped with minor physical injuries. In the years since, she had withdrawn from public life completely. The most recent mention Mark could find was a small piece in a Boston Society column, noting that Sophia had withdrawn from her prestigious private school in favor of home education and had declined to continue her musical studies despite exceptional promise. There was a photograph from before the accident. Sophia at 13 standing beside a grand piano where her mother sat, both dressed in formal concert attire that spoke of a world Mark had only seen in movies. The girl in the photo bore little resemblance to the silent young woman who'd sat on his garage floor. That Sophia was smiling broadly, eyes alight with confidence and joy as she held a violin. Someone who believed the world was full of possibilities and that she had the talent to grasp them. Mark closed the laptop, troubled by what he'd found, and equally troubled by what he hadn't. There was no mention of Sophia's silence, no explanation for why the daughter of one of America's wealthiest men would choose to spend her days in a run-down garage in rural Pennsylvania helping an 8-year-old organize toy cars. Most concerning was the absence of any reference to treatment or recovery beyond vague mentions of private care. Surely a man with Harrison Clark's resources would have secured the best psychological care available. Specialists who could help his daughter process whatever had happened in that car during the accident that killed her mother. As Mark rose to turn in for the night, his gaze fell on a photograph stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a wrench. Tommy at 6, sitting on Sarah's lap in her hospital bed, both of them smiling despite the circumstances, and the IV line snaking from her arm to the pump beside them. It had been taken just weeks before she died, when she'd still had good days between the bad ones, moments when the pain medication worked well enough that she could pretend everything might turn out differently than they both knew it would. Mark remembered how Tommy had stopped speaking for nearly a month after Sarah's funeral, how no amount of gentle questioning or professional counseling had broken through his silence. What had finally reached him wasn't therapy or medication or any of the recommended interventions. It was the Mustang. The day Mark had brought home that rusted shell on a flatbed trailer and asked for Tommy's help in making it beautiful again. His son had looked at the wreck of a car, then up at Mark, and spoken his first words in weeks. Mom would have loved this car. Perhaps, Mark thought, as he turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs, Sophia Clark wasn't so different from his son. Perhaps she too was waiting for the right restoration project to help her find her voice again. Something broken enough that fixing it felt meaningful. Something beautiful enough that the work itself became its own reward. Sophia returned the next morning as promised, arriving in a rideshare car at precisely 10 o'clock. She carried a larger backpack today, and when Tommy eagerly helped her unpack it, Mark saw she'd brought professional-grade art supplies, colored pencils in a wooden box that probably cost more than his monthly electric bill, fine-tipped markers in every shade imaginable, heavyweight paper that felt substantial even from across the garage, the supplies of someone serious about their craft, not a dabbler or hobbyist, but someone trained to create work that mattered. For the next several hours, as Mark worked on a timing belt replacement for a regular customer whose Accord had been coming to this garage longer than Tommy had been alive, Sophia and Tommy created information cards for each model car in the collection. Tommy provided the facts in his enthusiastic stream of consciousness style, and Sophia rendered them in artistic typography and illustrations that transformed simple car data into miniature works of art. Each card was a collaboration, Tommy's knowledge given form by Sophia's talent,
Their different ways of seeing the world combining into something neither could have created alone. The routine continued for a week. Each morning, Sophia would arrive at 10, sometimes bringing coffee for Mark or a new model car for Tommy's collection, purchased from some specialty shop in Boston that dealt in miniatures worth more than their size suggested. She never spoke aloud, continuing to communicate through notes and nods and the occasional text message displayed on her phone screen. Tommy chatted enough for both of them, sharing car facts and school stories and his dreams of becoming an automotive engineer someday, like the guys who designed the original Mustang and changed everything about what American cars could be. Mark observed the growing friendship with cautious approval, aware that he was allowing something to develop that might cause Tommy pain when it inevitably ended. Because it would end, of course it would. Sophia had a life in Boston, a father with resources and expectations, a world that didn't include rural Pennsylvania garages and 8-year-old boys who loved model cars. But watching Tommy bloom in Sophia's patient presence, seeing his natural enthusiasm find an audience that accepted it without judgment or condescension, Mark couldn't bring himself to put distance between them. Sometimes the risk of loss was worth taking if the alternative was never connecting at all. On the 5th day, as Sophia helped Tommy organize his collection of car magazines, creating a cataloging system based on publication date and featured content, Mark received a phone call that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up in that way it had in Iraq when his instincts screamed danger before his conscious mind identified the threat. Davis Auto. His voice came out steady, despite the sudden tension in his shoulders, years of military discipline maintaining calm even when his gut said something was wrong. The voice on the other end was crisp and authoritative, carrying the polished accent of old money and elite education, the kind of voice that expected compliance and rarely experienced refusal. "Mr. Davis, this is Harrison Clark. I believe you've been entertaining my daughter for the past week." Mark's eyes flickered to Sophia, who was focused on cutting precise rectangles from cardstock for Tommy's magazine clippings, unaware that her father had just entered their carefully constructed sanctuary via telephone line. Mark kept his voice neutral, professional, the tone he'd use with any concerned parent, even though this particular parent could probably buy and sell Mark's garage without noticing the expense. "Mr. Clark, what can I do for you? You can explain why my 17-year-old daughter has been spending her days in your establishment without my knowledge or permission." The pause that followed conveyed volumes about Harrison Clark's opinion of Mark's garage, the word establishment carrying implications of impropriety that made Mark's jaw tighten. He forced himself to breathe evenly, to remember that this man was speaking from fear and ignorance, not malice, though the distinction felt academic when accusation dripped from every syllable. "I'm not sure I'm the one who should be explaining that, sir. Sophia has been visiting of her own accord, working on a project with my son. They've been organizing his model car collection and creating educational materials about automotive history." There was a pause on the line, and Mark could almost hear the gears turning as Harrison processed information that didn't fit his assumptions about what his daughter might be doing in a place like this, with people like them. "Mr. Davis, I don't know what you think you're doing, but Sophia is under the care of specialists. She has been since her mother's accident. Whatever game you're playing needs to end immediately." Mark felt anger flare hot in his chest, the kind of protective fury that came when someone implied he'd do harm to a kid. Any kid, but especially one who'd shown his son nothing but kindness. He forced the anger down, buried it under years of learning when to fight and when to retreat. "No games, sir. Your daughter showed up at my garage when her vehicle broke down. She sits on the floor with my son and helps him organize his cars. That's the extent of it. She seems content here, peaceful even. I haven't pressured her to talk or do anything she doesn't want to do." The silence that followed stretched longer this time, and when Harrison spoke again, his voice had shifted, sharpened with sudden interest that felt more dangerous than anger. "She communicates with you?" Mark hesitated, looking again at Sophia, who was now showing Tommy something on her phone. Both of them bent over the screen with matching concentration. The question felt like a trap, though Mark couldn't identify exactly what kind. Not verbally.
She writes notes sometimes, or sends text messages when she has questions or wants to contribute to what Tommy's working on. She's very engaged with the project they're building together. Another pause, longer this time, and Mark could hear something that might have been surprise or shock being forcefully controlled. Sophia hasn't communicated willingly with anyone in 3 years, Mr. Davis. Not with me, not with her therapists, not with the specialists at the 3 private facilities where she's been treated. She responds when directly questioned, minimal yes or no gestures, but she doesn't initiate contact or express preferences or engage with activities beyond basic compliance. Mark absorbed this information, thinking of the elegant notes Sophia wrote to Tommy, the careful text messages she sometimes showed him when asking about tools or car parts, the way she'd taken initiative in reorganizing Tommy's entire collection without being asked or directed. If what Harrison was saying was true, and Mark had no reason to doubt it, then something about this garage had reached Sophia in ways that years of professional intervention hadn't. I don't know what to tell you, Mr. Clark. She seems comfortable here, and she's been good for my son. Tommy lost his mother 5 years ago, and he's had trouble connecting with other kids. Sophia's been patient with him in a way that's helped them both. Harrison's voice turned hard again, decision made, and communicated with the certainty of someone accustomed to getting his way. I'm sending Vincent to collect her. He'll be there within the hour. This has gone on long enough. Before Mark could respond, before he could formulate an argument or appeal or anything that might delay the inevitable, the line went dead. Harrison Clark had spoken and expected compliance, the way powerful men always did, assuming their decisions would be implemented without resistance, because resistance was something that happened to other people. Mark set the phone down slowly, considering whether to warn Sophia about her father's call and deciding against it. Whatever was happening between the Clarks was their business, their family dynamic to navigate or destroy. His responsibility was to Tommy and to maintaining the safe space they'd created here, not to insert himself into conflicts between billionaires and their complicated daughters. For the next 40 minutes, Mark continued working on a brake job, occasionally glancing at the pair in the corner who remained absorbed in their project, unaware that their time together was being measured in minutes now, rather than days. When Vincent's Escalade pulled into the lot at precisely 11 o'clock, moving with the efficiency of military precision applied to civilian logistics, Sophia went completely still. Her pencil froze mid-stroke, her shoulders stiffened, and the light that had gradually returned to her eyes over the past week dimmed like someone had turned down a rheostat. Mark wiped his hands and walked over to meet Vincent at the side door, positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary, though he wasn't sure what intervention would look like or accomplish. Vincent nodded curtly, his professional mask firmly in place, though Mark thought he detected a flicker of something that might have been regret or sympathy in the man's eyes. Morning. I'm here for Miss Clark. Vincent's tone was careful, neutral, someone delivering a message he hadn't written and maybe didn't agree with, but would execute regardless because that was his job. Mark stepped aside to allow Vincent entry, but positioned himself where he could still see both Vincent and Sophia, old instincts about maintaining situational awareness kicking in automatically. She's with my son. They're working on a model car display, almost finished with the organizational system they designed together. Vincent approached cautiously, like someone expecting a skittish animal to bolt, his movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. Miss Clark, your father has asked me to bring you home.
Sophia looked up, and Mark saw the change immediately, watched the transformation happen in real time, like someone pulling a mask over their face. The light in her eyes dimmed completely. Her posture went rigid, and the almost animation that had characterized her movements over the past week vanished behind that same mask of careful neutrality she'd worn when she first arrived.
She set down her pencil with deliberate precision and began packing her supplies with mechanical efficiency, each movement controlled and empty. Tommy watched in confusion, looking between Sophia and the adults with the bewilderment of a child who sensed something wrong but couldn't identify what or why.
Are you leaving? We haven't finished the Shelby section yet, and
You said you'd help me write the description for the GT500 because it's special and needs the right words.
Sophia didn't respond, couldn't respond, her movements becoming increasingly mechanical as she closed her backpack and prepared to leave this place that had briefly felt like sanctuary. Mark recognized the behavior from his military days, the shutting down that happened when a situation became emotionally untenable, and the only defense was to stop feeling anything at all.
Tommy, why don't you show Vincent the display you and Sophia have been working on? I bet he'd like to see the 1970 Chevelle SS you added yesterday, the one with the twin racing stripes. His voice came out gentle, redirecting his son's attention to give Sophia space to compose herself, or fall apart, or do whatever she needed without an audience.
Tommy hesitated, glancing between his father and Sophia, then nodded with the trust of a child who believed adults generally knew what they were doing, even when evidence suggested otherwise. It's the one with a 454 cubic inch V8 engine that made 360 horsepower, which was a lot back then, even though it doesn't sound like that much now compared to modern performance cars.
Tommy led Vincent toward the display, pointing out features and explaining historical context with his usual enthusiasm, drawing the security man's attention away from Sophia, who had finished packing and now sat motionless on the floor, staring at nothing. Mark moved closer, crouching beside her so they were at eye level, so she could see his face without having to look up.
"You okay?" The question was inadequate, useless, really, but Mark didn't know what else to offer beyond presence and acknowledgement that this moment mattered, that her leaving wasn't just logistics, but loss. Sophia remained still, her notebook clutched to her chest like armor against whatever waited outside this garage. "You're welcome back any time. This garage has been here 27 years. It'll be here tomorrow, too, and the day after that. The door's always open." For a moment, Sophia's hand stilled on her backpack strap. Then, in a movement so quick Mark almost missed it, she tore a page from her notebook and slipped it under the model of the 1967 Mustang Fastback, the same model as the car Mark was restoring, the one that represented rebuilding and second chances and the possibility that broken things could be made whole again. "Miss Clark, we need to go." Vincent had extricated himself from Tommy's enthusiastic explanation and now stood waiting with professional patience that didn't quite hide the urgency underneath. Sophia stood, backpack clutched to her chest, and walked toward the door without looking back. The emptiness had returned to her eyes completely. The vacancy that Mark had watched gradually fill over the past week, now restored like someone had reset her to factory settings. After they'd gone, after the Escalade's taillights had disappeared down the road and silence had settled over the garage again, Tommy turned to Mark with trouble written across his young face in lines too deep for 8 years old. "Did I do something wrong, Dad? Why didn't she say goodbye?" Mark wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, feeling the small body lean into him with the trust that still amazed him after all these years. The faith that dads could explain things and make them better even when they couldn't. "You didn't do anything wrong, buddy. Sometimes people have complicated lives, especially grown-ups who are dealing with things that happened before you even knew them. Sophia's going through something difficult that doesn't have anything to do with you or how good a friend you've been to her. But she isn't a grown-up. She's a teenager." Tommy's voice carried the precision of someone who valued accuracy, who wanted the world to make sense according to clear categories and definitions. Mark smiled despite the weight in his chest. "You're right about that. But she's dealing with grown-up problems, the kind that don't have easy answers or quick fixes. Sometimes all we can do is be kind to people and give them space to figure things out in their own time." He nodded toward the car display, the work Sophia and Tommy had accomplished together over the past week. "Why don't you show me what you two finished today? I want to see how you organized everything." As Tommy began explaining their organizational system with renewed enthusiasm, Mark noticed the corner of paper sticking out from beneath the Mustang model. When Tommy moved to the next section, Mark carefully extracted the note, unfolding it to reveal Sophia's elegant handwriting. 7 words that made his chest tight. "Thank you for making me feel human again." Mark refolded the note and slipped it into his shirt pocket, next to the space where he still carried Sarah's wedding ring on a chain because he couldn't bring himself to put it in a drawer where he wouldn't feel its weight against his heart. Some messages weren't meant to be shared, even with Tommy.
Some pain was private, meant to be witnessed but not broadcast. That evening, as Mark was closing up the garage and running through his mental checklist of locks and lights and equipment that needed to be secured, a different vehicle pulled into the lot. Not the Escalade, but a Rolls-Royce Ghost, its sterling silver Spirit of Ecstasy hood ornament catching the last rays of the setting sun and throwing light like a beacon. Mark straightened instinctively, wiping his hands on his work pants, though they were already clean. Old habits about presenting yourself properly when someone important showed up. A tall, distinguished man emerged from the driver's seat, and Mark recognized Harrison Clark from the photos in those business magazines, though the images hadn't quite captured the force of his presence. Tall and impeccably groomed, with silver-streaked dark hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command, Harrison moved with the certainty of a man who believed the world would rearrange itself to accommodate his passage. His tailored suit probably cost more than Mark's monthly mortgage payment, and his shoes gleamed with the high polish of someone who had others to worry about mud and rain and the small indignities of actual walking. Mr. Davis. Harrison extended his hand, and Mark accepted the handshake automatically, noting the firm grip and the slight calluses that suggested this billionaire wasn't entirely removed from hands-on work, that somewhere beneath the expensive clothes lived someone who occasionally did things himself. Mr. Clark. Didn't expect to see you in person. Figured you'd handle everything through intermediaries and phone calls like most people at your level do. Friday morning arrived with the kind of cold that made breath visible and turned windshields into frosted glass overnight. Mark woke before his alarm, stomach tight with anticipation that felt too much like the mornings before combat missions, when you knew the day would change everything but couldn't predict how. He made coffee strong enough to strip paint, stood at his kitchen window watching dawn break over Oak Ridge, and thought about a 17-year-old girl who'd found her voice in his garage and now had to prove to strangers that she deserved to keep it. The competency hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock at the Bedford County Courthouse, a brick building that had stood since the 1920s and carried the weight of every custody battle, guardianship petition, and family tragedy that had passed through its doors. Mark arrived early with Tommy, who'd insisted on coming despite Mark's suggestion that maybe courtrooms weren't the best place for 8-year-olds. But Tommy had written his letter to the judge and wanted to see Sophia, to offer whatever comfort an 8-year-old could provide to someone fighting for her freedom. They found James Wright in the hallway outside the courtroom, looking every inch the Marine turned attorney in a suit that managed to be both professional and slightly rumpled, the kind of man who valued competence over polish. He was reviewing notes on a yellow legal pad, but looked up when Mark approached. The good news is, we've got strong evidence of Sophia's daily functioning, her rational decision-making, her therapeutic progress with Dr. Grant. The bad news is, Harrison Clark has unlimited resources, and Dr. Winters is a very credible witness with 30 years of experience treating traumatic mutism. James's voice was matter-of-fact, the same tone he'd used in Iraq when briefing missions with high casualty risk. You didn't sugarcoat danger, you named it and prepared for it. What are our actual chances? James considered, weighing honesty against optimism. 50-50 if Sophia can't or won't speak in court. 70-30 in our favor if she can demonstrate verbal communication and rational thought under pressure. But Mark, that's a lot to ask of someone who hasn't spoken in 3 years. The stress alone could trigger shutdown. Before Mark could respond, a door opened down the hall and Sophia emerged with Dr. Grant, flanked by Vincent, who'd driven them from Oak Ridge. Sophia wore a simple black dress that made her look older than 18, professional and composed in a way that seemed calculated to project competence. But Mark saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped her notebook like a lifeline, the careful neutrality of her expression that he'd learned to recognize as fear contained behind walls. Tommy broke free from Mark's side and rushed to Sophia, stopping just short of hugging her with the awareness that maybe she needed space right now. I wrote the best letter I could. I told the judge about how you taught me to draw and helped organize my cars, and how you're really smart about art and history, and you remember everything I tell you about engines. His voice carried such earnest conviction that Sophia's carefully controlled expression cracked slightly, something warm breaking through. She knelt down to Tommy's level, opened her notebook, and wrote quickly, Thank you for believing in me. That matters more than you know. Tommy read it and nodded solemnly. Of course I believe in you. You're my friend. Friends believe in each other even when things are hard. The courtroom doors opened at 8:45, and they filed inside to a space that managed to be both utilitarian and oppressive. All dark wood and fluorescent lighting, and the smell of old paper and anxiety. The judge's bench loomed at the front, empty for now. A witness stand to one side, and tables for petitioner and respondent facing each other, with the aisle between them like a demilitarized zone. Harrison Clark was already seated at the petitioner's table with two attorneys Mark didn't recognize, both wearing suits that probably cost more than Mark's truck. Harrison looked like he hadn't slept well. Circles under his eyes, darker than Mark remembered, but his posture remained rigid with determination. When Sophia entered, he looked at her with an expression so complex, Mark couldn't begin to untangle it. Love and fear and guilt and desperate hope, all mixed together. Sophia took her seat at the respondent's table beside James, with Mark directly behind her in the first row of the gallery. Dr. Grant sat beside Mark, radiating calm competence. Vincent positioned himself near the back, officially neutral, but present in a way that mattered. Tommy squeezed into the seat next to Mark, his feet barely touching the floor, hands clasped in his lap with uncharacteristic stillness. All rise, the bailiff's voice cut through the nervous quiet, and everyone stood as Judge Margaret Chen entered, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and the kind of face that suggested she'd heard every story and believed none of them until proven otherwise. She settled behind her bench, reviewed papers before her, and looked up with eyes that missed nothing. Be seated. We're here for a petition for limited conservatorship filed by Harrison Clark regarding his daughter, Sophia Clark, age 18. Mr. Clark contends that Miss Clark is not competent to make her own medical and residential decisions due to documented mental health conditions and requires court-appointed oversight for her protection. Judge Chen's voice was neutral, clinical, reducing Sophia's life to legal categories and procedural questions. She looked at Harrison's attorneys. Counsel, you may present your case. The lead attorney, a man named Richard Pemberton, with the smooth confidence of someone who'd never lost a case he cared about, stood and laid out Harrison's argument with surgical precision. He called Dr. Rebecca Winters first, and she took the witness stand with the authority of someone accustomed to being believed. Dr. Winters, you evaluated Sophia Clark at her current residence 3 weeks ago. Can you describe what you observed? Dr. Winters opened a leather portfolio, though Mark suspected she had the details memorized, and the papers were just professional theater. I observed a young woman living in substandard conditions above an automotive repair facility with minimal supervision and inadequate support structures for someone with her documented psychiatric history. Miss Clark has been diagnosed with persistent traumatic mutism, major depressive disorder, and complex PTSD stemming from a vehicular accident in which her mother died while Miss Clark was trapped in the vehicle for 72 minutes. The courtroom went still at that detail, the horror of it settling over everyone like fog. Judge Chen's expression didn't change, but she made a note on her legal pad. During your evaluation, did Miss Clark communicate verbally? No, Your Honor. She communicated exclusively through written notes, which is consistent with her 3-year pattern of selective mutism. While her written responses demonstrated coherent thought, the inability or unwillingness to speak is a significant indicator of ongoing psychiatric distress. And in your professional opinion, is Miss Clark capable of managing her own medical care and living independently? Dr. Winters hesitated just long enough to seem thoughtful rather than predetermined. No, Your Honor. While I observed that Miss Clark has formed some positive attachments in her current environment, attachment alone does not indicate competency. Her panic attack response to rain triggers, documented by Mr. Davis himself, demonstrates that she lacks the emotional regulation necessary for independent living. She requires structured residential treatment with 24-hour professional support to ensure her safety and continued recovery. James rose for cross-examination, and Mark watched him transform from rumpled veteran to surgical interrogator. Dr. Winters, you testified that Miss Clark communicated through written notes. Were these notes coherent?
Yes.
Did they demonstrate understanding of her situation? Yes, but did Miss Clark answer your questions appropriately and with relevant detail? Generally, yes, though the content... So Miss Clark demonstrated the ability to understand questions, formulate appropriate responses, and communicate her thoughts clearly. The only difference was the medium of communication? Dr. Winter's jaw tightened. The medium matters, Mr. Wright. Verbal communication is a baseline indicator of psychological health and social functioning. Is it? I'd like to submit into evidence recent studies showing that selective mutism in trauma survivors does not correlate with diminished cognitive capacity or decision-making ability. Would you like to review them? I'm familiar with the literature. However, you also testified about a panic attack triggered by rain. How many panic attacks has Miss Clark experienced in the 3 weeks since you evaluated her? Dr. Winters consulted her notes. 1 documented incident. 1. In 3 weeks of independent living. How many panic attacks did Miss Clark experience during her most recent stay at your Boston facility? Dr. Winters' face tightened. That information is confidential. Your Honor, I have Miss Clark's signed release. Dr. Winters? Judge Chen nodded. Answer the question, Doctor. Miss Clark experienced frequent episodes of distress during her residential treatment. The exact number varied. Would you say more or less than 1 every 3 weeks? More. So Miss Clark is actually having fewer panic attacks while living independently than she did under 24-hour professional supervision? The situations are not comparable. Residential treatment often involves confronting difficult material. Or, Dr. Winters, could it be that removing Miss Clark from institutional settings where she has no autonomy has actually improved her emotional regulation? That's speculation, based on the evidence you just confirmed. No further questions. James sat down, and Mark saw Sophia's hands relax slightly on her notebook. The first round had gone better than expected. Dr. Winters' credibility dented, if not destroyed. But Harrison's attorneys weren't finished. They called Harrison next, and he took the stand with visible reluctance, someone who preferred boardrooms to witness boxes, but would endure the discomfort for his daughter. Pemberton walked him through Sophia's history with clinical efficiency. The accident, the 72 minutes, the 3 years of treatment failures, the specialists who'd all recommended continued residential care. Mr. Clark, why did you petition for conservatorship? Harrison's voice was steady, but Mark heard the strain underneath. Because I'm terrified of failing her again. 3 years ago, I made a choice that seemed reasonable at the time, taking a different car to finish a business call, and that choice cost my wife her life and my daughter her voice. I won't make another choice that puts Sophia at risk. You love your daughter very much, more than anything in this world, which is why I can't stand by and watch her struggle in an environment that isn't equipped to handle her needs. Mr. Davis is a good man with good intentions, but he's not a mental health professional. His garage isn't a treatment facility, and Sophia deserves the best care available, not well-meaning amateurs. The words stung, despite Mark understanding they came from fear rather than contempt. Harrison wasn't wrong that Mark lacked credentials or training. He was only wrong about what Sophia needed. James's cross-examination was gentler, recognizing that Harrison was a grieving father rather than a hostile witness. Mr. Clark, you testified that you love your daughter very much. Do you believe she loves you? Harrison blinked, not expecting the question. Yes, I believe so. When was the last time Sophia initiated physical affection with you before 3 weeks ago? Harrison was silent for a long moment. I can't remember a specific instance since the accident. And 3 weeks ago? She hugged me. On her birthday, before I left her apartment. It was brief, but it was genuine. Would you describe Sophia as generally more engaged with you now than she was 3 months ago? Harrison's expression twisted with something that might have been hope or might have been pain. Yes, she communicates with me through notes now. She asks questions. She expresses preferences. At lunch on her birthday, she told me about her mother's teaching methods for art. It was the first time she'd mentioned Victoria by name since the funeral. And you don't consider that progress worth preserving? I consider it progress that might be lost if we don't maintain professional oversight. Improvement can be temporary,
Regression is always possible. But Mr. Clark, isn't forcing Sophia back into institutional care against her will also a form of regression? Taking away the autonomy she's just started to reclaim? Harrison had no answer that didn't damn him, so he said nothing. James nodded and returned to his table. After Harrison stepped down, Pemberton rested the petitioner's case, and James called his first witness, Dr. Elizabeth Grant. She took the stand with the calm authority of someone whose credentials were unimpeachable and whose commitment to Sophia was obvious. Dr. Grant, you've been treating Sophia Clark for the past month. Can you describe her progress? Dr. Grant's voice was warm but professional, the voice of someone who'd spent years making complex psychological concepts accessible. Sophia has made remarkable progress in a very short time. She's demonstrated increased emotional regulation, expanded her willingness to communicate through writing, taken initiative in planning activities and solving problems. Most significantly, she's begun processing her mother's death in therapy rather than avoiding all mention of the trauma. But she still doesn't speak. Correct. However, selective mutism is not an indicator of incompetence or inability to function independently. It's a trauma response that may resolve with time and appropriate support, or it may persist as Sophia's preferred mode of communication. Either way, it doesn't prevent her from making rational decisions about her life. In your professional opinion, is Sophia capable of managing her own medical care? Absolutely. She attends therapy sessions voluntarily, engages fully with the therapeutic process, follows treatment recommendations, and demonstrates clear understanding of her condition and its implications. And independent living? With appropriate support structures, yes. Sophia has demonstrated the ability to manage daily tasks, maintain her living space, prepare meals, budget her resources, and seek help when needed. The panic attack Mr. Clark mentioned is evidence of her good judgment. She recognized a crisis, reached out for support, and worked through it with assistance. That's exactly what we want to see in independent adults. James yielded for cross-examination, and Pemberton stood with papers in hand. Dr. Grant, you've been treating Miss Clark for only 1 month, is that correct? Yes. And in that month, how many sessions have you conducted? 8 sessions, twice weekly, so 16 hours of contact total, versus the 3 years and hundreds of hours that previous specialists spent trying to help Miss Clark. Why should this court value your assessment over theirs? Dr. Grant's smile was sharp. Because I've seen more progress in those 16 hours than they documented in 3 years. Sometimes fresh perspective matters more than accumulated time, especially when the accumulated time produced minimal results. The courtroom stirred with suppressed reaction, and Judge Chen's lips twitched with something that might have been approval. Pemberton frowned but moved on. You testified that Miss Clark's panic attack demonstrated good judgment because she sought help. But doesn't the panic attack itself demonstrate fragility that requires professional oversight? It demonstrates trauma response, which is different from fragility. Every trauma survivor experiences triggers and difficult moments. The question isn't whether they occur, but how they're managed. Sophia managed hers by reaching out, processing the experience, and continuing with her daily life. That's resilience, not fragility. Pemberton tried a few more angles but couldn't shake Dr. Grant's fundamental assertion. Sophia was competent, improving, and deserved autonomy. When he finally yielded, James called Mark to the stand. Mark had testified in court before, depositions for accident cases and workers' comp claims, but never with stakes this high. He swore to tell the truth and settled into the witness chair, finding Sophia's eyes across the room. She looked terrified but present, watching him with an intensity that steadied his nerves. Mr. Davis, how did you meet Sophia Clark? Her vehicle broke down outside my garage during a rainstorm. She came inside with her security detail and sat on the floor with my son while I repaired the car. And what was your impression of her? Mark chose his words carefully. That she was someone dealing with profound grief, who'd been treated as a problem to solve rather than a person to see. My son didn't try to fix her or make her talk. He just shared his cars with her and accepted whatever communication she offered. And something about that acceptance reached her. James walked Mark through the weeks of Sophia's visits, the car display collaboration, the birthday lunch with Harrison, the apartment arrangement. Mark described Sophia's daily routines, her growing competence with cooking and budgeting, her engagement with garage customers, her panic attack, and how she'd handled it. Mr. Davis, in your opinion, is Sophia capable of living independently? With appropriate support, absolutely. She's not trying to isolate herself or reject all help. She's just asking for the same thing any 18-year-old wants: the freedom to make mistakes, learn from them, and build a life on her own terms. Pemberton's cross-examination was aggressive, trying to paint Mark as an unqualified meddler who'd inserted himself into a family crisis for unclear motives. Mr. Davis, you have no training in psychology, psychiatry, or social work, is that correct? That's correct. You have no professional credentials that qualify you to assess anyone's mental health or competency? No professional credentials. Just 27 years of fixing broken things and recognizing the difference between what's actually broken and what just needs space to heal on its own timeline. That's a poetic sentiment, Mr. Davis, but this court deals in facts, not metaphors. You're asking us to trust your untrained judgment over that of multiple specialists with decades of combined experience. I'm asking you to look at the evidence. Sophia has made more measurable progress in 4 weeks with me than in 3 years with those specialists. That's not metaphor, that's documented fact. Pemberton tried to shake Mark's testimony to get him to admit that maybe he was in over his head, maybe Sophia's progress was temporary, maybe professional care was safer. But Mark had faced hostile interrogations before, in contexts more dangerous than courtrooms, and he held his ground until Pemberton finally dismissed him with obvious frustration. The final witness was Vincent Porter, called by James in a move that visibly surprised Harrison. Vincent took the stand with military bearing, and Mark saw Harrison lean forward, realizing his own security chief was about to testify against his petition. Mr. Porter, you've been employed by the Clark family for 7 years, is that correct? Yes, I was hired when Miss Sophia was 11 years old. And you were present during the accident that killed Mrs. Clark? No, I had the day off. I've always regretted not being there. The admission carried weight, guilt shared across all the players in this tragedy. James nodded and continued. In those 7 years, you've observed Sophia in many contexts. How would you characterize her current functioning compared to the past 3 years? Vincent didn't hesitate. She's more present, more engaged, more herself than I've seen since before the accident. The girl who sat on that garage floor and drew cars with an 8-year-old is closer to the Sophia I knew before tragedy changed her than anyone I've seen in any treatment facility. But she still doesn't speak. Speaking isn't the only measure of being heard. Sophia communicates clearly, makes decisions rationally, expresses preferences and boundaries. She's not silent because she can't find words. She's silent because silence feels safer than speaking in a world that took everything from her in one terrible moment. Given time and space, maybe that will change. Or maybe it won't. But either way, she deserves to choose her own path. Pemberton's cross-examination tried to frame Vincent as disloyal, as someone whose judgment was compromised by sentiment. But Vincent remained calm, professional, unshakable in his assessment that Sophia was competent and that conservatorship would destroy the progress she'd made. When Vincent stepped down, James turned to Judge Chen. Your Honor, I'd like to call Sophia Clark to testify. The courtroom went absolutely still. Harrison's face drained of color. Doctor? Winters leaned forward with clinical interest. Mark's hands tightened on the bench in front of him, and Tommy grabbed his arm. Sophia stood slowly, her notebook clutched against her chest, and walked to the witness stand with measured steps. The bailiff administered the oath, and Sophia nodded her understanding. She sat down, and every eye in the courtroom fixed on her with an intensity that must have felt crushing. James approached gently, giving Sophia space. Sophia, I know this is difficult. You can answer my questions in writing if you prefer, and we'll read your responses into the record. Is that acceptable? Sophia nodded and opened her notebook. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote. Actually, before we begin, there's something I need to say. She tore out the page and handed it to James, who read it aloud. The courtroom waited in suspended animation, everyone understanding that this moment mattered more than any testimony or expert opinion. Sophia took a deep breath that Mark could see from across the room. Her hands gripped the witness stand, knuckles white with tension. She looked at her father first, then at Judge Chen, and then she opened her mouth. The word came out hoarse, scratchy from 3 years of disuse, but absolutely clear in the silent courtroom. No. She paused, gathering strength, and Mark realized he'd stopped breathing. Sophia continued, her voice clearing with use, though still rough. I was trapped with my mother's body for 72 minutes. 72 minutes of knowing she was dead, and I couldn't help her, and nobody could hear me screaming for help. When they finally cut me out, everyone kept asking me questions. How did I feel? What did I remember? What did I need? Her voice cracked, but didn't break. I needed everyone to stop asking. I needed the world to be quiet so I could figure out how to exist in it without my mom. So I stopped talking, and everyone panicked. They sent me to specialists who tried to make me talk. They put me in facilities where every minute was scheduled and monitored and documented. They measured my progress by whether I would speak, as if words were the only thing that mattered. Judge Chen was leaning forward now, fully engaged. Harrison had tears streaming down his face, not even trying to hide them. But nobody asked what I actually needed. They just decided what I needed and tried to force me to accept it. For 3 years, I've been a problem to solve, a condition to treat, a case study for medical journals. I haven't been a person. I haven't been Sophia. She looked directly at her father. Dad, I know you're scared. I know you blame yourself for Mom's death. I blamed you too, for a long time, but it wasn't your fault. It was an accident. A terrible, random accident that none of us could have prevented. Harrison's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs, and Mark saw the weight of 3 years' guilt breaking apart. You've spent 3 years trying to keep me safe, trying to fix what happened by controlling everything you can control. But you can't keep me safe from life, Dad. And you can't fix grief by managing it with protocols and facilities and specialists. Sophia's voice was getting stronger, more confident, each word reclaiming territory she'd ceded to silence. I found something at Mr. Davis's garage that I couldn't find anywhere else. Permission to be broken and still worthy of care. Nobody there tried to fix me or change me or measure my progress against some treatment timeline. Tommy just wanted someone to listen to him talk about cars. Mr. Davis just gave me space to exist without demands or expectations. And somehow, in that space, I started to remember who I was before the accident. Not the same person. I'll never be her again. But someone new. Someone I can actually live with. She turned to Judge Chen directly. Your Honor, I'm not asking to be declared perfectly healthy or fully recovered. I'm asking to be recognized as an adult, capable of making my own choices, even imperfect ones. I'm asking for the right to try, to fail, to learn, to grow on my own terms, instead of having my father's fear dictate my entire life. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratch of the court reporter's fingers on keys, documenting words that 3 years of specialists had failed to coax out. I don't know if I'll ever be comfortable speaking all the time. Maybe silence will always feel safer. But that's my choice to make. And if I make mistakes, if I struggle, if I need help, that's human. That's what everyone does. I'm not a fragile thing that needs to be locked away and protected. I'm just someone trying to build a life after trauma destroyed my old one. Sophia's hands relaxed on the witness stand, some of the tension draining from her shoulders. I love my father. I know he loves me. But love doesn't mean control, and protection doesn't mean preventing me from living. I'm asking this court to let me try. She sat back, finished, and the courtroom remained frozen for a long beat. Then James stepped forward. Sophia, do you understand what conservatorship means? Yes, it means my father would have legal authority to make medical and residential decisions for me, that I would lose autonomy over my own life. And do you believe you're capable of making those decisions yourself? I believe I'm capable of making decisions with appropriate support. I'll continue therapy with Dr. Grant. I'll maintain daily contact with my father. I'll reach out for help when I need it. But I need the freedom to make my own choices, even if they're different from what my father would choose for me.
James nodded and yielded for cross-examination. Pemberton approached carefully, aware that attacking a girl who'd just found her voice after 3 years would play poorly. Miss Clark, your ability to speak now is remarkable.
But can you guarantee you won't regress? That you won't experience another crisis? Sophia's answer was immediate. No, I can't guarantee that. Nobody can. Life doesn't come with guarantees. But I can promise to handle crises the way I handled the panic attack 3 weeks ago, by reaching out, accepting help, and continuing forward instead of shutting down. You mentioned that Mr. Davis's garage gave you permission to be broken. Don't professional treatment facilities offer the same thing? Sophia's voice carried conviction that went beyond her years. Treatment facilities offered me protocols, daily schedules, group therapy, medication management, crisis intervention plans. Those are valuable things for people who need them. But they didn't offer me what I actually needed, which was to be seen as a whole person instead of a collection of symptoms. To have relationships that weren't therapeutic relationships, to make art without it being art therapy, to help a little kid with his cars without it being some kind of socialization exercise measured for progress. She paused, finding words for something complex. I needed normal life with support, not managed life disguised as treatment. There's a difference. Pemberton tried a few more questions, but couldn't shake Sophia's fundamental competence or the clarity of her testimony. When he sat down, Judge Chen looked at Sophia with something that might have been respect. Miss Clark, I'm going to ask you some questions directly. You may answer verbally or in writing, whichever you prefer. Sophia nodded. I'll try to speak. Do you understand that independent living comes with responsibilities, bills, household maintenance, medical appointments, all without someone managing those things for you? Yes, Your Honor. I've been managing those things for 3 weeks. I make mistakes, but I learn from them. Do you understand that your father's petition comes from love and concern, not from a desire to control you? Yes, I understand his fear, but I can't let his fear prevent me from living my life. If I were to grant this petition, you would have someone making sure you follow treatment recommendations, maintain stable housing, avoid situations that might trigger regression. Wouldn't that make your life easier? Sophia's answer was quiet, but firm. Easier, maybe, but not mine. I don't want someone else's version of a safe life. I want my own life, with all its difficulty and uncertainty. I spent 3 years being managed, and it didn't make me better. It made me dependent. I need to learn to handle life's difficulties myself, with support when I need it, but not constant supervision. Judge Chen made notes, her face unreadable. Finally, she looked up. I'm going to take a brief recess to review the evidence and testimony. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. Everyone rose as Judge Chen left the bench, and the courtroom erupted into movement and conversation. Sophia stood slowly from the witness box, looking drained but present in a way Mark had never seen. Harrison crossed the aisle without hesitation and pulled his daughter into an embrace that was fierce and desperate and 3 years overdue. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You're right. I've been trying to control everything because I couldn't control that night, and I was terrified of losing you too. Harrison's words came out broken, all pretense of control abandoned. Sophia held her father and spoke words that Mark suspected had been waiting 3 years to emerge. It wasn't your fault, Dad. The accident wasn't your fault. You couldn't have saved her. Nobody could. And you haven't lost me. I'm right here. But I need you to let me figure out who I am now, not who I was before. They stood like that for a long moment, father and daughter finally communicating across the chasm that grief had carved between them. Then Sophia pulled back, wiped her eyes, and looked at her father with clear determination. Whatever the judge decides, I want you to know I love you. But I can't go back to being managed. If you can't accept that, we'll figure out what relationship we can have. But I won't sacrifice my autonomy for your peace of mind. Harrison nodded, accepting terms he had no choice but to accept. I understand. And if the judge rules in your favor, I'll respect it. I'll try to be the father you need instead of the protector I thought you required. Mark watched this from a few feet away, Tommy pressed against his side, both of them witnessing a reconciliation that was messy and imperfect and real.
Doctor. Grant approached Sophia, squeezing her shoulder with quiet approval. Vincent stood back but offered a small nod that carried volumes of respect. The 30 minutes felt like hours. Mark bought coffee from a vending machine that produced something allegedly coffee-flavored, but mostly tasted like regret. Tommy sat beside Sophia, showing her pictures on his phone of the new models he'd added to their display, normal conversation anchoring her to something beyond the weight of the hearing.
When the bailiff called them back, Mark's heart was hammering hard enough to hurt. They filed into the courtroom and stood as Judge Chen returned to the bench. Her expression gave nothing away, neutral authority that could go either direction. Be seated. I've reviewed the testimony and evidence presented today, and I want to address several points before rendering my decision. Judge Chen looked at Harrison. Mr. Clark, your love for your daughter is evident, and your concern for her well-being is both understandable and commendable. You've invested tremendous resources and effort into securing what you believed was the best care possible. However, the court notes that those 3 years of intensive professional treatment produced minimal measurable progress, while 1 month of independent living with appropriate outpatient support has produced remarkable improvement. She shifted her gaze to Sophia. Miss Clark, your testimony today demonstrated clear cognitive function, rational thought processes, understanding of your situation and its implications, and the ability to self-advocate articulately. While your selective mutism is documented and ongoing, it does not appear to impair your decision-making capacity. The court is particularly persuaded by your willingness to speak when the stakes required it, showing flexibility and judgment rather than rigid disability. Judge Chen reviewed her notes before continuing. Dr. Winters provided credible testimony about Miss Clark's history and the challenges she faces. However, the court places greater weight on Dr. Grant's assessment, based on recent sustained observation, that Miss Clark is capable of independent living with appropriate support structures. Mark felt hope rising, but didn't let himself believe until the words were actually spoken. The court finds that Sophia Clark, age 18, is competent to make her own medical and residential decisions. The petition for conservatorship is denied. The courtroom erupted. Tommy cheered loud enough to draw a sharp look from the bailiff. Harrison dropped his head into his hands, shoulders shaking, and Mark couldn't tell if it was relief or grief or both. Sophia sat perfectly still, processing. And then she turned to James and spoke 2 words that carried the weight of everything she'd fought for. Thank you. Judge Chen wasn't finished. However, the court strongly recommends that Miss Clark continue twice-weekly therapy with Dr. Grant, maintain regular contact with her father, and establish a safety plan for managing crisis situations. The court also recommends that Mr. Clark respect his daughter's autonomy while remaining available as a supportive resource. This family has experienced tremendous trauma, and healing will require ongoing effort from everyone involved. She looked at both Sophia and Harrison. I'm not declaring this situation perfect or without risk. I'm simply recognizing that an 18-year-old woman has the right to make her own choices, even imperfect ones, and that sometimes the path to healing doesn't look like what parents or professionals expect it to look like. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a finality that made it real. Sophia had won. She had claimed her voice and her autonomy in the same breath, and nobody could take either away from her now. What followed was chaos of the best kind. Tommy hugged Sophia with all the enthusiasm of an 8-year-old who'd witnessed justice done. Dr. Grant embraced her with quiet pride. James shook her hand formally and then, abandoning formality, pulled her into a hug that made her laugh, a sound Mark had never heard from her and suspected few people had in 3 years. Harrison approached slowly, uncertain of his welcome after fighting so hard to take away what Sophia had just won. But Sophia turned to her father and spoke words that were gift and challenge both. I need you to be okay with this. I need you to trust that I can handle my life, even when it's hard. Can you do that? Harrison's voice was rough with emotion. I can try. That's all I can promise. To try to trust you, to respect your choices, to be there when you need me without hovering when you don't. It won't be easy, but I'll try. Sophia nodded, accepting the honest answer over false promises. They stood together awkwardly, still learning how to be father and adult daughter instead of father and traumatized child. But Mark saw hope in the uncertainty. Outside the courthouse, Pennsylvania sunshine painted everything gold despite the November cold. Mark stood with Tommy on the courthouse steps, while Sophia spoke with Dr. Grant and Harrison handled paperwork with his attorneys. Vincent approached Mark, extending his hand. Thank you for fighting for her. I've watched Sophia trapped in silence for 3 years. Seeing her find her voice today was worth whatever employment consequences come from testifying against my employer's interests. You think Harrison will fire you? Vincent shrugged. Probably not. He's smart enough to recognize that I testified truthfully, and truth shouldn't cost employment. But even if he does, some things matter more than job security. Mark shook Vincent's hand firmly. You're a good man. Sophia's lucky to have you watching her back. The drive back to Oak Ridge felt different, lighter, like atmospheric pressure had dropped and breathing was easier. Sophia rode with Mark and Tommy, having told Harrison she'd see him Sunday for their scheduled dinner. Tommy chattered the entire way about how cool it was that Sophia had spoken in court, and how the judge had been really smart to see that she was okay, and how they still had so much work to do on the car display. Sophia sat in the passenger seat, responding occasionally with single words that were easier now that the seal had broken, but mostly listening with the kind of attention that made Tommy's enthusiasm feel valued. Mark drove in comfortable silence between conversational bursts, watching the Pennsylvania countryside slide past, and thinking about how much had changed in 4 weeks. Back at the garage, Mark suggested they celebrate, and Tommy immediately demanded pizza, despite having had pizza approximately 60 times in the past month. But Sophia wrote a note saying pizza sounded perfect, so Mark called the local place and ordered enough for a small army. While they waited, Sophia and Tommy worked on the car display, adding 3 new models that had arrived during the week and creating information cards with their collaborative precision. Mark puttered around the garage, not accomplishing much, but present and available, watching the two of them together and thinking about Sarah and how she would have loved this girl who'd found healing in their chaotic space. The pizza arrived with Dr. Grant, who'd stopped by to check on Sophia post-hearing and ended up staying for the impromptu celebration. Harrison showed up 20 minutes later, having apparently been invited by Sophia via text, looking uncertain but willing. Even Vincent appeared, technically off-duty, but pulled by genuine care for how this day ended. They sat in the garage's small office area, sharing pizza and soda, while Tommy regaled everyone with detailed descriptions of each model car in the display. Harrison listened with surprising attentiveness, asking questions that showed actual interest rather than polite tolerance. Sophia answered some verbally, others through notes, finding her own balance between speech and silence. I brought something. Harrison reached into the bag he'd carried in and pulled out a carefully wrapped package. He handed it to Sophia with the nervousness of someone offering a gift that might not be wanted. I've been looking for this for years. Never could find one in the right condition. But last week I called every collector and dealer I could locate, and someone in Ohio had one. Sophia unwrapped it carefully, revealing a vintage owner's manual for a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback, Acapulco Blue Edition, in pristine condition. Her eyes widened, understanding the significance. It's not the car my father and I restored. I sold that for startup capital and regretted it for 30 years. But the manual survived in my father's garage, and I kept it because it reminded me of time we spent together when I was young and stupid enough to think business success mattered more than relationships. Harrison's voice carried regret that went beyond cars. I can't get that Mustang back. But maybe this manual can be part of the Mustang you're restoring here. A piece of my father's legacy connecting to your new beginning. Sophia took the manual with reverence, opened it carefully, and saw handwritten notes in the margins. Someone's observations about timing adjustments and carburetor settings written in faded ink. She looked up at her father and spoke words that were still difficult but necessary. "This is perfect, Dad. Thank you for understanding what I need, instead of just what you think I need. It's a start. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to want to fix things and protect you and control situations. But I promise to listen when you tell me I'm overstepping." Harrison's honesty was its own gift, acceptance that healing wasn't a destination but an ongoing process. Sophia nodded, and they shared a moment of understanding that was fragile but real. Mark raised his soda can in an impromptu toast. To Sophia, who showed us all what real courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but doing the hard thing despite being terrified. Everyone raised their drinks, and Sophia's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't look away. Tommy added his own contribution. And to Dad, for letting Sophia stay even when it was complicated. And to the Mustang, because it's almost done, and it's going to be so cool. The laughter that followed was genuine, easy, the kind that came when people who'd been through hard things together found reasons for joy. They finished the pizza and cleaned up together, a makeshift family formed from shared trauma and the willingness to see each other clearly. As the evening wound down and people prepared to leave, Mark pulled Harrison aside for a private word. "What you did today, accepting the verdict even though it wasn't what you wanted, that took real strength. Sophia knows it. It matters." Harrison nodded, looking older than his years, but somehow lighter too, like he'd set down weight he'd been carrying too long. "I realized something when she was testifying. I've been so focused on keeping her safe that I forgot to let her live. My father used to say that protecting your children from every hardship just creates adults who can't handle difficulty. I didn't understand what he meant until today." He glanced at Sophia, who was showing Vincent something on her phone while Tommy looked on. "She's stronger than I gave her credit for. And maybe that strength came from having to survive the worst thing imaginable and finding a way forward anyway. I can't take that away from her by wrapping her in professional care and calling it love." Mark clapped Harrison on the shoulder, a gesture of solidarity between fathers who'd both lost wives and both struggled to raise children in the aftermath. "She's going to be okay. Not perfect, not without hard days, but okay, which is all any of us can really hope for." After Harrison left, after Dr. Grant and Vincent departed with promises to check in soon, Mark found himself alone in the garage with Sophia and Tommy. The boy was nearly asleep on his feet, exhausted from the day's emotional intensity, so Mark sent him to wait in the truck. Sophia stood in front of the Mustang, now uncovered, Harrison's vintage manual in her hands. Mark joined her, both of them studying the car that had become symbol and sanctuary both. "Thank you." Sophia's voice was quiet but clear, and Mark turned to look at her. "For what?" "For seeing me when everyone else saw a problem. For giving me space to figure out who I am instead of trying to make me into who I was. For believing I could do this before I believed it myself." Mark shook his head. "You did the hard work. I just provided the garage and the coffee." Sophia smiled, and it transformed her face, banishing the careful neutrality she'd worn like armor for so long. "You provided hope. That mattered more than you know." She opened the Mustang's passenger door and sat down carefully, running her hands over the newly restored interior, feeling the texture of upholstery Mark and Tommy had installed with painstaking attention to authenticity. "Can I learn to drive this when it's finished?" Mark grinned. "I was hoping you'd ask." "We're close to completion. Another week, maybe 2 for final details. Then we'll take her out, and I'll teach you how to handle a 67 Fastback. Fair warning, she's got more personality than modern cars. Takes some getting used to. I'm good at getting used to things now. I've had practice." The confidence in her voice was new, earned through fighting for autonomy and winning, through speaking after 3 years of silence
and discovering the world didn't end when she used her voice. Mark checked his watch. I should get Tommy home before he falls asleep standing up. You good here? Need anything? Sophia shook her head, then reconsidered. Actually, yes. Can you show me how to check the oil? I want to start learning basic maintenance, not just admiring the car. So Mark spent the next 20 minutes teaching Sophia how to check oil levels, read dipsticks, identify signs of leaks or problems. She absorbed the information with focused attention, asking questions that showed she was thinking beyond rote memorization to actual understanding. When they finally finished, and Sophia headed upstairs to her apartment, Mark stood alone in the garage, turning off lights and locking doors, and felt Sarah's presence so strongly, it was almost physical. This is what you would have wanted, he thought. This is what healing looks like. Messy and imperfect and real. The next week passed in comfortable routine. Sophia worked mornings in the garage, learning to change oil and replace filters, and diagnose common problems under Mark's patient instruction. Afternoons she spent with Dr. Grant in therapy sessions that were productive precisely because they were chosen rather than mandated. Evenings varied, sometimes working with Tommy on the car display, sometimes cooking dinner with recipes that got slightly less disastrous each attempt, sometimes just sitting and drawing while the radio played classic rock. Harrison visited twice, scheduled dinners at a local restaurant where he and Sophia navigated the strange new territory of being adults together rather than parent and child. Their conversations were sometimes awkward, sometimes painful, but always honest in ways they hadn't been for years. Sunday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the hearing, Mark announced that the Mustang was finally, completely finished. Every detail attended to, every system tested, the car perfect in the way that old cars could be when restored with love and precision. Tomorrow, we take her for a proper drive, but tonight, I thought we should do the ceremonial first start with everyone who helped build her. Mark had invited Harrison and Vincent, who arrived together and stood awkwardly in the garage, like guests at a wedding who weren't sure of the protocol. Tommy bounced with barely contained excitement, having been promised he could sit in the driver's seat during the start, even though his feet didn't reach the pedals. Sophia stood beside the Mustang, and Mark handed her the keys with ceremonial gravity. You should do the honors. You helped finish what Sarah and I started. Seems right that you turn her over for the first time since completion. Sophia took the keys, hands steady now, and slid into the driver's seat. Tommy scrambled in beside her, and everyone else gathered around as Sophia turned the key. The engine caught immediately, that perfect roar of American muscle car engineering, 390 cubic inches of V8 power, purring with the satisfaction of machinery working exactly as designed. The sound filled the garage, rich and powerful, and Sophia's face lit up with pure, unguarded joy. She gave it a little gas, listening to the engine respond, feeling the power available at the touch of her foot. Then she turned it off and sat in the sudden silence, looking at Mark with something like reverence. She's perfect. Thank you for letting me be part of this. Thank you for helping finish what I couldn't complete alone. Tomorrow we teach you to actually drive her. Tonight we celebrate her completion. They stood around the Mustang like family around a new baby, everyone's phone out taking pictures, Tommy narrating a detailed history of the restoration for anyone who would listen. Harrison touched the car reverently, remembering his father and the Acapulco blue Mustang he'd sold and regretted, and Sophia saw the grief and understanding in her father's face. Dad, want to sit in it? Driver's seat. Pretend for a minute it's your car. Harrison looked surprised by the invitation, but accepted, lowering himself into the seat Sophia had just vacated. His hands found the steering wheel automatically, muscle memory from decades ago coming back, and he sat there with his eyes closed for a long moment. When he opened them again, there were tears on his face, but he was smiling. My father would have loved this car, and he would have loved knowing that his granddaughter helped restore one just like the one we built together. Thank you for giving me this moment. The next morning arrived cold and clear, mid-November promising winter, but delivering one last gift of sunshine before the darker months arrived.
Mark drove the Mustang to an empty parking lot on the outskirts of Oak Ridge, a vast expanse of asphalt behind a shuttered factory where Sophia could learn without the pressure of traffic or witnesses. Tommy rode shotgun, having been promised he could watch every second of the lesson. Sophia followed in Mark's truck with Vincent driving, her nervousness obvious, but mixed with determination that Mark recognized from the courtroom. Sophia slid behind the wheel, adjusted the seat and mirrors with the careful attention Mark had taught her, and put both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Mark leaned in the window from outside, keeping his voice calm and instructive. Remember, clutch in, shift to first, give her a little gas while you ease off the clutch. Feel for the friction point where the engine wants to grab. Too fast, and you'll stall. Too slow, and you'll just sit here revving. Find the sweet spot in the middle. Sophia nodded, took a breath, and tried. The car lurched forward 6 inches and died, engine cutting out with a disappointed sputter. Tommy called encouragement from the passenger seat. "That was better than Dad's first try. He stalled like 5 times before the car even moved." Sophia smiled, despite her frustration, and tried again. This time she found the friction point better, and the Mustang rolled forward smoothly for about 20 feet before she panicked and hit the brake too hard, killing the engine again. "Good. That's progress. You're getting the feel for it. Try again." They spent an hour in that parking lot, Sophia gradually mastering the coordination of clutch and gas and steering, learning to shift from first to second without grinding gears, practicing turns and straight-line acceleration. Her confidence grew with each successful lap until she was cruising around the parking lot at a respectable speed, shifting smoothly, looking almost comfortable. Ready to try the actual road? Nothing major, just the back roads around Oak Ridge, low traffic, familiar territory. Sophia's expression showed nerves, but also determination. She nodded, and Mark climbed into the back seat, letting Tommy stay up front where the excitement was better. The Mustang handled beautifully on real roads, responsive and powerful, but not overwhelming. Sophia drove carefully, taking turns slow and watching for other vehicles with hyper-vigilance that would relax with experience. Mark gave quiet directions, letting her focus on the mechanical task of driving rather than worrying about navigation. They drove for 40 minutes through Pennsylvania countryside, brilliant with late autumn color, past farms and small towns and stretches of forest that had stood long before cars existed. The radio played classic rock on low volume, just background music to the engine's rumble and the sound of tires on pavement. Finally, Mark directed Sophia to a long, straight road with no other traffic visible, a perfect stretch of rural route where you could see a mile in each direction. "You've done great with the basics. Want to feel what she can really do? Just a little acceleration. See how she responds when you ask for power." Sophia glanced at Mark in the rearview mirror, checking if he was serious, then pressed the gas pedal more firmly. The Mustang responded instantly, acceleration pressing them back into seats as the engine roared and the speedometer climbed. Sophia's face transformed, fear replaced by exhilaration, and she laughed out loud. The sound was pure and unself-conscious, joy escaping without filter or control. Tommy whooped beside her, and Mark grinned from the back seat, watching this girl who'd been silent for 3 years discover that she could laugh and speak and drive and live, that trauma hadn't destroyed her capacity for happiness. Sophia eased off the gas as the road curved ahead, downshifting smoothly, bringing the Mustang back to legal speeds with the skill of someone who'd internalized the lessons. She pulled over at a scenic overlook and turned off the engine, sitting in the sudden quiet with her hands still gripping the wheel. "I did it. I actually did it." Her voice carried wonder, disbelief mixing with pride. Mark leaned forward from the back seat. "You did. And you're going to do a lot more things that feel impossible right now. This is just the beginning, Sophia. Your whole life is ahead of you." She turned to look at him, and Mark saw someone different from the vacant-eyed girl who'd sat on his garage floor 6 weeks ago. This Sophia was present, engaged, hopeful in ways she probably hadn't been since before her mother died. "Thank you. For everything. For the garage and the apartment and the testimony and this moment.
for seeing possibilities in me when I couldn't see them myself.
Mark reached forward and squeezed her shoulder. That's what family does. Not blood family necessarily, but chosen family. The people who show up and stay and believe in you, even when you don't believe in yourself. They sat there for a while. 3 people in a restored Mustang overlooking Pennsylvania farmland, bound by shared experience and the understanding that healing happened in unexpected places with unlikely people. 3 months later, on a February afternoon when snow dusted the ground and made everything look clean and new, a young woman in her 20s pulled into Davis Auto's parking lot. She sat in her car for a long moment before getting out, working up courage for whatever brought her here. Mark was under a Chevy when he heard the door chime, and he slid out to find a stranger standing uncertainly just inside the garage. She was pale and thin, dressed in clothes that looked expensive, but hung on her frame like she'd recently lost weight, and her eyes had the familiar haunted quality Mark had learned to recognize. Before he could greet her, Sophia emerged from the apartment stairs, heading down for her afternoon shift. She'd been working in the garage 4 days a week since January, learning the business and proving remarkably skilled with engine diagnostics. She stopped when she saw the visitor, and Mark watched recognition pass between them, the unspoken understanding of shared trauma. "Can I help you?" Sophia's voice was clear now, comfortable, though she still preferred silence in moments of stress or overwhelm. The visitor looked at her with something like hope mixed with desperation. Someone told me that there was a place here where people understand about not talking, about needing space to figure things out after something terrible happens. Her voice was small, uncertain, and Sophia's expression softened with immediate empathy. She walked closer, and Mark saw her consciously gentle her approach, making herself non-threatening. "What's your name?" The woman hesitated, then whispered, "Rebecca." "Rebecca, I'm Sophia. And yes, this is a place where people understand, where you don't have to explain or perform or prove anything, where you can just be exactly who you are right now, broken pieces and all." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, and Sophia reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, giving time to refuse. When Rebecca didn't pull away, Sophia took her hand. "Come on. There's someone I want you to meet. His name is Tommy, and he's going to tell you more about cars than you ever wanted to know. But he won't ask questions you don't want to answer, and he'll accept whatever you can give." Mark watched Sophia lead Rebecca toward the corner where Tommy was working on an expanded version of the car display, now covering an entire wall and including detailed historical information that had become something of an attraction for gearhead customers. Sophia introduced them simply, and Tommy looked up with his characteristic enthusiasm, unclouded by adult assumptions about appropriate behavior. "Want to see my newest acquisition? It's a 1970 Plymouth Superbird, and the aerodynamics are really interesting because most people thought they looked weird, but actually they were super effective for racing." Rebecca nodded mutely, and Tommy launched into his explanation while Sophia settled beside them, offering quiet presence without demanding engagement. Mark turned back to his work, leaving them to it, but feeling satisfaction settle warm in his chest. This was what healing looked like in the long term. Not just your own recovery, but becoming someone who could help others find their way back. Sophia had traveled from broken silence to spoken strength, and now she was passing forward the gift that Mark and Tommy had given her 6 months ago. That evening, after Rebecca had left with promises to return tomorrow, after Tommy had gone home with Mark for dinner, Sophia sat in her apartment and opened the journal she'd been keeping since the hearing. Dr. Grant had suggested it as a way to process thoughts and emotions that were still sometimes too complex for spoken words, and Sophia had found value in putting pen to paper, externalizing the internal work of healing. She wrote, "6 months ago, I couldn't imagine speaking again. The silence felt safer than words, like armor against a world that had proven it could destroy everything I loved. But silence also meant isolation, meant being trapped inside my own head with no way to connect or share or grow. Then I met an 8-year-old boy who just wanted someone to listen to him talk about cars, and a mechanic who understood that sometimes broken things need space and patience instead of aggressive intervention. They gave me permission to be exactly who I was, grieving, silent, struggling. And somehow that permission became the foundation for rebuilding myself into someone new. I'm not the girl I was before Mom died. That Sophia was confident and talented and believed the world was mostly safe and good. This Sophia knows the world can be cruel and random and devastating. But this Sophia is also stronger, more empathetic, more aware of her own resilience than that younger version ever was. I speak now, most of the time, because I choose to, rather than because I have to. Some days, silence still feels necessary, and that's okay. I'm learning to honor what I need instead of performing for other people's comfort. Dad and I have dinner every Sunday. We talk about his work and my garage apprenticeship, and sometimes, carefully, about Mom. It's not the relationship we had before the accident, but it's honest and real and growing. He's learning to be proud of who I am instead of grieving who I was, and that shift means everything. Today, a woman came to the garage carrying the same kind of pain I used to carry. I recognized her immediately, saw myself in her haunted eyes and careful movements. And I realized I've traveled far enough in my own healing that I can help someone else begin their journey. That feels important. Not just getting better, but being able to share what I learned, to pass forward the gifts I was given. Sophia looked out her window at the garage below, where lights still burned and Mark was finishing some late project. The Mustang sat in its designated spot, Highland green and perfect, symbol of rebuilding and second chances and the understanding that broken things could be made beautiful again. She turned to a fresh page and began to sketch. Not the garage this time, but a memory she'd been avoiding for 6 months. Her mother at the piano. Victoria's face turned toward Sophia with pride and love, the moment frozen before tragedy intervened. Sophia drew carefully, tears streaming down her face, but her hand remained steady. This was the work now, learning to hold grief and hope simultaneously, to remember what was lost while building what could be. It wasn't easy, would never be easy, but it was possible. And possibility was enough. The sketch took shape under her hands, beautiful and painful, an act of remembering that didn't destroy her. When she finished, Sophia set down her pencil and whispered words meant for a mother who couldn't hear them but needed to be said anyway. I'm okay, Mom. It took a long time, but I'm okay. I found people who help me remember how to live instead of just survive. And I'm learning to use my voice for things that matter, to speak truth and advocate for myself and help others find their own paths forward. You'd be proud of the woman I'm becoming, not the prodigy you raised, but someone stronger and stranger and more herself than that girl ever was. I miss you every day, but the missing doesn't destroy me anymore. It just makes me appreciate the time we had and the lessons you taught me about seeing beauty in the world. Thank you for loving me enough to make silence possible when I needed it. And thank you for teaching me, through your life and art, that there's power in claiming your own voice and using it for what you believe in. I'm going to be okay, Mom. I promise. Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, covering Pennsylvania in white silence that was peaceful rather than oppressive, clean and new and full of possibility. In her apartment above a garage in Oak Ridge, Sophia Clark sat with her journal and her memories and her hard-won hope, learning to live in a world that had broken her and discovering that breaking wasn't the same as destroyed. Sometimes, she thought, the most beautiful things were the ones that had been shattered and carefully pieced back together, the cracks filled with gold that made them more valuable than they'd been before. She was becoming one of those things, a kintsugi person, broken and rebuilt and somehow more whole for having survived the breaking. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.